In this video, we're going to discuss more about hypothesis generation, and then I'll do a little activity to help you to solidify how to develop a good hypothesis. So, again, this chapter 2, is just discussing the first steps of the research process. And so we've talked about finding a research idea, how to do that literature search, and all those things that go along with finding that research idea. To finish up this chapter, we're going to talk about how to form a hypothesis. And again, you'll have an activity that will hopefully help solidify in more detail about what constitutes a good hypothesis. So just briefly going to discuss the characteristics of a good hypothesis so that when you're doing your activity, you can make sure that you're generating good hypotheses. So the first one is that it has to be logical. So again, you're going to take some basic observations and facts that you've accumulated using various sources of knowledge, and you're going to draw a logical conclusion for that hypothesis. So when you're using that hypothesis to predict something, to predict that outcome, it needs to be logical. It needs to follow a logical argument. It needs to be testable. So we've briefly introduced this word before, and testable, it's important. So that's kind of why we're re-emphasizing this idea. To be testable means that all the variables, events, and individuals can be defined with that operational definition, observed, and tested. If you can't do one of those, if you can't define it properly and very specifically, you can't observe it and you can't test it, it's not testable. And so it doesn't make a good hypothesis if that hypothesis can't be tested. And falsifiable. So oftentimes I kind of use the words testable and falsifiable interchangeably. Your book here kind of differentiates. So falsifiable means that the hypothesis is worded in such a way that it can be proven false. So I guess in some ways you could have a hypothesis where the variables, events, and individuals can be defined, observed, and perhaps tested, but you would not be able to prove the hypothesis false. So that's where they kind of just, differentiate. To me, again, testable and falsifiable are kind of two sides of the same coin, and they are really the backbone of the hypothesis. If you cannot test the hypothesis or prove it false, it is not a good, valid hypothesis. You need to rework it. And sometimes a lot of those pseudoscientific hypotheses out there will look logical, but there's something about them that can't be tested or can't be proven false. And finally, it needs to be a positive statement. This doesn't mean a good statement. It just means that it needs to make a statement about the existence of something. So positive means that it's adding something. So it's not a question. So a hypothesis is not a question. You have a research question, and from that research question, you develop a hypothesis, which is kind of your best guesstimate of what's the outcome's going to be for one variable is going to affect another variable if we're talking about an experiment. And just an example for testable and falsifiable is another way to think about falsifiable is refutable as well. So can I hypothesize that extraterrestrials do not exist? Okay, that's a positive statement. Extraterrestrials do not exist. Okay, it could be based off some logical information. So if it can satisfy that logical aspect, it can satisfy the positive characteristic, but can it be tested or proven false? No, you can't prove that extraterrestrials do not exist, okay? Because we can't search all the outer boundaries of the universe. But we could say, with our current technology, we cannot detect extraterrestrials. So then, we use our current technology, we search for extraterrestrials, we cannot detect them, we can say, that is true. We could prove that false if we did detect extraterrestrials with the current technology. So it can be proven false in that manner. So just keep it in mind. Sometimes a hypothesis just needs to be reworked a little bit to make it so that it is falsifiable.